Joining us for the discussion on this matter, our guest, Seth Asafo. He's a clinical psychologist. We also have Dr. Michael Bwampong, a lecturer in childhood and youth studies, an associate professor at the Open University in the United States. Gentlemen, a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. I don't know whether I've heard both of you. I just want to check before we start the conversation. If any of you hasn't unmuted, so we can hear you. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
All right.
And thank you very much for having me.
Great, great. Right before we dig into some of the salient matters to address this morning, I'd like to find out from you what your initial reactions are to what you just saw. I mean, I was observing the two of you as you watched the harrowing story of Diana, and I noticed from the expressions on your faces that, I mean, you had a lot to talk about. What are your initial reactions to her story? I'll start with you, Mr. Asafo.
Well, I would say that it's a very sad experience that our sister went through, and nobody obviously should have to endure anything like that. In fact, these things exist a lot, and they're happening a lot as a lot of people trying to immigrate. And I know that as a fact, even those people listening, some people are actually feeling the same emotions that our sister went through. It's more like some form of trauma that they're also going through. And whatever our authorities can do to help, curb these kinds of things is really important. In the same light, we should be available to offer support to people who've endured these things, to help them to get back into society, functioning very well. Yes. Dr.
Bwampong?
Yes, I think I would join Dr. Tio in saying that at the same time, the issue of irregular migration is quite a very troubling experience. And if from the experience of Diana, you could see that she went through a very harrowing and dehumanizing, experience of having to, go into servitude and slavery. If, we have to put it into modern day context, and, having to see this is quite very troubling. And I think that it's about time that we look into the underlying drivers of irregular migration, because if you look at, her experience, there are a lot of factors that pushed her into embarking on this, harrowing, experience. So it's very important that our leaders, address the underlying causes of irregular migration. So it's much more of a structural issue beyond the personal experiences that some of these young people experience.
Now, especially as you are a lecturer in childhood and youth studies, I want to run this by you. In 2019, there was a study conducted all the way from 2017 with regard to some students in SHS, JHS, who had actually migrated to some of these countries, about 1,000 of them being brought back to Ghana with different reasons for having left the shores of our country. The focus there being why these young people are embarking on these perilous journeys in the first place. What would you call a justifiable explanation for what has been happening?
That's a very important question. When we look at migration, I think one of the things that we have to realize that, as a society, migration in itself is a cultural endeavor and expectation in our society. So in Ghana, for instance, there are some notions like, travel and see. And a lot of the times, for most young people in our society, migration is more or less a form of poverty reduction strategy within households, where, when you get to a certain age, your parents would expect you to maybe cater for your younger siblings. So it's more of something that also in our society is becoming very much common, that, you need to travel at a certain stage in your life. And at the same time, also the underlying cause of, poverty, which most households experience. And, most households would expect, younger people who are growing up to be able to find a way of living, to be able to take care of the younger siblings. And we also realize that, the whole issue of, when you look at the experience of Diana, for instance, she wanted to, embark on education. But in the cost of education, which I know in Ghana, for instance, we would talk about free education. But education in itself is not free. If you look at, the cost of education, most of the times people would prefer private education because that is much more of quality education compared to public education. And even with a public education, you may need some supplementary form of, education to be able to come at pair with, the ways of having to get a better, grade to be able to proceed on to, higher education into university. So there are a lot of factors that, cause most of these young people to move, but that is not enough justifiable excuse for them to embark on irregular migration. But we need to be able to address the underlying cause of irregular migration. The other thing that I would add is that when we look at migration, in most cases, is a segment of people who are not able to embark on regular migration. So there are people who are able to embark on regular migration to, Europe. They are able to get on a plane. They are able to further their studies in, Western countries. But unfortunately, there are a segment of our society, young people, perhaps maybe the poor, those who are less connected, who are unable to get the kind of, migration that would be able to afford them the decent life that they need. So I think that is one of the things that we need to look into in terms of also government having to find legal options for young people to move. Perhaps with a scholarship secretariat, being able to afford young people the opportunity to find education in other countries that they are not going to be abused. At the same time, also for those people who want to work in other countries, having to have bilateral agreements with other countries to be able to get the kind of decent work that they need in other countries.
Let me cross over back to Mr. Asafo. Now, let's explore a bit of the psychological impact, the trauma of going through some such experiences. Diana was paralyzed. Half her body was paralyzed at a point in just attempting to escape being lynched, so to speak, by the second family she worked with. Then, now she has to deal with health issues. She's still grappling with broken vertebrae when it comes to her backbone and all of that. What would you say is the psychological impact of people who go through these experiences? And what do we do to bring them back, properly reintegrate them into society?
Well, there are several levels of the effects of, experiences on different people. And I'd say that even for a normal immigration, if you want to do it on your own accord, it's not as that. It's not so simple, especially if you're going to another country which has a different set of norms and routines that you're not used to. The change in itself is stressful. So regardless of whether you have the means or not, the change in itself is stressful. That's one. Now, for Diana's special case, you can look and observe almost instantly that she's going to have a constant reminder of that threat that has caused her to be in this state. And that's what brings us to issues of trauma. In a lot of instances, when people have gone through some form of stressor which is unexpected or unusual and is significant, this causes them to have a compromised view of the world, or that their safety becomes threatened in the absence of danger. Now, whenever you have an expectation and that expectation is not met, it leads to disappointment. Disappointment can come with its own bout of feelings of anxiety and feelings of low. I'm careful not to say depression because that means something very significant, but extended periods of feeling low could actually push someone to suffer significant mental health complications of depression and anxiety. And the trauma in itself could lead to ill health and even skew people's view of the world. In a lot of instances, people who have been devalued in such manners have always felt that they've become worthless. And it's one of the issues, or one of the things that drives people to take their own lives or to commit suicide. I think Diana has been very strong in being able to deal with this and to come back to even talk about it. And we know that talking about it in itself helps to heal the process, as it allows an avenue to vent. One thing that we have as a people who have interdependent cultures or collectivist cultures like that of Africa is we have a lot of social support. And it's one of the ways in which people like this can be reintegrated back into society, where there's help from everybody to help them to deal much better with this. Now, the kinds of help could be psychological, it could be emotional, it could be financial. And all of these are aimed to make the person regain the value that's been taken away from them. Now, in her description, she talks about how, they sort of threatened her, showing a gun, locking her up, beating her up. And all these are attempts to sort of devalue you. Now, when they devalue you, they take away your sense of worth. And if that's gone, you definitely would succumb to anything they ask you to do. So it's a conditioning that was being done. And it's interesting that she was able to stand so strong, even in spite of all of these things. But it's a regular thing that is done everywhere, where people push you to the point where you become helpless, or a state we call learned helplessness. And once you get helpless, you constantly will have to do what they want. We can reintegrate her back. The psychosocial support out there for her, and I am personally willing to offer her any assistance which has to do with psychosocial support if she requires any. But social support from the family and the friends and from the community as a whole is also essentially important. I know that there are people who are saying, but why would you go stay in Ghana? Well, it's so easy to say these things. But like Dr. Buampom said, the issue of poverty, the issue of the systemic issues of educational standards and lack of opportunity is definitely going to drive more of these things. And it becomes necessary for us to improve these things if we can contain or manage it from one level. At least it will reduce the load. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Asafo, and also for that, generous gesture, because sometimes even accessing, assessing when it comes to psychological assistance becomes a problem. So granting access to her or offering this is a big deal. We'll let Diana know. Dr. Buampong, now, we know that for years there's been a moratorium. In fact, at the time when Diana traveled, she shouldn't have been able to do so. There are certain, elements that have been put in place to forestall this kind of travel to some regions of the world, owing to what has happened in the past. But we still see them happening. What do we do? Is it a lapse in our regulations? What is it? How do we deal with the situation?
That's a very good question. And as I said earlier on, we have some structural problem here. So if we would recall, in 2017, the government, banned, a migration to the Gulf countries. And, as a matter of fact, she shouldn't have traveled. But the thing with migration is that when it comes, it's an expectation in our society. And it's also driven by many factors. So there is always going to be the tendency for people to move. But then how they move is the question. And when there are no formal or, better ways in which, people are able to move through legal options, they take advantage of, illegal means, and they often become very much vulnerable to traffickers. So I think that is something that, government, as a matter of fact, needs to pay immediate attention to in terms of, removing the ban and making sure that there are legal options for people to move.
So just to clarify, Dr. Buampong, so you want the ban to be removed, basically, but in removing it, what do we replace it with?
I think that when you look at, institutions like the ILO, there are a lot of labor standards that needs to, be the underlying element of labor agreements. And these are things that I believe that the Ministry of Employment and Labor has expertise on. And also there are a lot of institutions in Ghana. So these stakeholders need to come together, and as a matter of urgency, they need to address this issue. We are talking about 2017 and we are in 2021, and the lives of people still need to move on with the everyday realities that they face. So they are, going to move, and that's something that we need to, pay particular attention to. That these are the everyday lives of people. They are real lives of people that we need to take, attention on, and put away all the politics that comes about with, the mobility of people. It's something that we need to pay attention to, and also make sure that human rights is at the heart of labor agreements, and people are able to move in a very dignified way if they have to embark on migration.
Let me just take your thought on that as well, though that may not be your focal area, Mr. Asafo. But if irregular migration is the problem, what do you think we can be doing to, foster regular migration?
Well, I mean, if you ask me, I'd say that a lot of this has to do with the kinds of socializations that we have. Currently, I am in a field of what I call, or what we call, indigenous psychology, where we try to say that majority of the knowledge that's been created, about the world is not situated or does not particularly function as it is. It's not as universal as people have made it seem. So we're now looking at concepts for the African purpose and the African people. Now, in this regard, I could say very quickly that sometimes the kinds of depictions of how things look, or the philosophy of the grass is greener on the other side, is partly one of the main reasons why these kinds of things happen. So people are migrating because of a perception. And these perceptions have been created by and large by the people who wanted to serve their purpose. And so I've seen several documentaries of Ghana, and it always looks very terrible. And I've seen documentaries of other countries, and they've shown the beautiful parts of the country. It makes it seem like every part of those countries are awesome, but that's not what it is. There are places there which can be as terrible. In fact, we might do far better off than that. So I think the whole socialization and the education, or what is being depicted, especially from the perspective of social media and what people are sharing and the ideologies they have, which of course have migrated far from our ideologies as an African and Ghanaian people, is partly one of the reasons why this has become a significant thing.
Dr. Bwampong, earlier you were speaking about some discourse between countries and all of that dialogue. I would like to find out from you, on the back of the sort of experiences we've heard time and again, including Diana's experience, where it appears almost as though the governments of these countries, so to speak, are in cahoots in a way, because you talk about the fact that some of them go for months without getting paid, only to have their employer say they have stolen something, they are thrown into prison, no justicial system really to elaborate on the case, and then they are repatriated or deported to their countries. This has become routine in a lot of these countries where Ghanaians and other Africans, other migrants go to. What sort of engagement should be brought to bear when it comes to these countries and their governments to ensure that there are some checks? What do you think ought to be done?
So in terms of having to do with this, I think that there is the importance of bilateral labor agreements. And most of the times when we have, these labor agreements, as I said earlier on, there are labor standards that are international labor standards. And I'm sure Ghana, must have signed up onto some of these international labor migration standards. And we need to make sure that they are at the heart of, the labor migration agreements that we agree on with various countries. And even in the case of, Diane's experience, I believe that some of these countries, they have, embassies in Ghana or missions in Ghana. We need to hold them accountable to some of these things that are going on. And the experiences of these young people doesn't need to be tolerated. But essentially, we also need to make sure that, migration in itself is something that comes up as a result of a choice and not something that people have to be forced on to, embark on. So that's something that, is really, is on my heart in terms of, how we see migration, that not everybody would want to, go out there and experience all these things that, Diane has experienced. it's often the case that, people don't have alternatives, back home in Ghana. And that's the reason why they do this. But then migration in itself is something that is part of us as human beings. We would want to experience different things in different countries. And it's something that needs to only happen as a matter of choice and not as a matter of, necessity.
As you spoke, something came to mind, and I'm wondering whether we don't need more awareness creation, maybe in our syllabi, our curricula, even from school. Because I remember, again, going back to that study in 2019, awareness creation, especially among the target groups, those leaving junior high school, senior high school, these are the people, on the educational ladder all the way till about 26 years, who are usually enticed to embark on these journeys. In terms of education, since that is one of your focal areas, what do you think we ought to be doing as government and as a people?
So as said earlier on, migration in itself is a perception. It's not always greener at the other part of the world. As a matter of fact, people even in other countries are also wishing to be in Ghana. If you look at the recent news, Steve Wonder even wants to be in Ghana. And that's something that maybe people will find it difficult to accept. But migration is something that I know there are a lot of institutions in Ghana that are embarking on, information campaigns. And, it's something that needs to target young people in schools, because often there is that misconception that it's always greener out there. So when you give people the benefit of having, the real life experience, how do people live their everyday lives overseas? Then they are able to make informed choice as to whether they want to move or not. And if they do so, it would be at their own risk. But then in the end, as I always keep on emphasizing, that migration is part of our, it's part of our lives as human beings. Everybody wants to travel. And we need to get to the stage where, we work with other countries to make sure that there are legal options for young people to move to other countries to study or to work in those countries. So education is a very important thing, and we need to be at various levels of education, at primary, secondary, and university level, to make sure that young people are well informed. But any information campaigns in itself also, I would want to emphasize that it shouldn't be about creating the culture of making young people sedentary, agents, that they should always stay at home. Migration in itself, when you look at the data and research, you realize that there is a huge potential or huge benefit in migration. But that huge benefit and the outcome in terms of remittances that comes back is able to in itself help other young people to acquire education, improve health conditions, improve, the consumption levels of households that are in poverty. So it's something that we need to make sure that whilst we embark on information campaigns, we don't just, look at young people or target them as people who need to sit at one place. We need to expand their choices, and development only comes about when you expand the choices of people. So that is something that the government needs to pay particular attention to in terms of expanding the choices of people to be able to move. And if they do so, to move legally or through approved means.
We'll be wrapping up on this conversation shortly, but just a few more matters to address. There are agencies that are legitimate, that are actually, they have legal access to embark on some of these activities to get people traveling through the right means. There also are illegal channels or illegal agencies. What do we do about them?
So we need to, I think those who are, illegal or are not registered, we need to criminalize their activities and, make sure that they are...
But Dr. Bwampong, pardon the interruption, their activities are criminal. And in fact, if you look at it, it appears they are, transporting a lot of these people outside the shores of Ghana, Ethiopia, other countries. They are even doing more than the entities that are legally mandated to do this.
Yeah, so that's very true. But then, do we really make sure that the law, takes us action on them, if even they are criminal? That's something that if their activities are criminalized and they are brought to bear, even for the media also to get involved in putting out maybe the faces of people who are practicing some of these things, I'm sure that would, be a way of scaring away people, and for young people who are likely to be susceptible to these agents to know these individuals and to stay away from them. So I think it's a whole societal approach that we need to make sure that different stakeholders, the media, the security agents are able to bring these people to bear and make sure that they are not able to do business, as a matter of fact. And
right.
In that case, also the alternative of those who are doing the proper legal work, their work could be expanded and make sure that they are able to engage with government and work to make sure that young people who want to move are able to do so legally.
Right.
Because this is the 21st century. I'm sure that a lot of young people aspire to work overseas. They aspire to acquire quality education to be able to improve on their lives. And we need to make sure that the options that are legal are available to them to make use of them.
Mr. Asafo, now you have offered very generously some assistance to Diana, but even right here on air, looking at the fact that she's been physically battered, she's been called all sorts of horrendous names. I mean, you heard her. They called them donkey, monkey, goat, and all kinds of things. Looking at the physical and psychological trauma she's been through, Diana is actually watching us right now. What would you say to her in terms of something that can aid her psychological processes, how she feels now? What would be your message?
Well, the most important thing for her to recognize is that what happened is not her fault, first of all. Secondly, she was only doing something that was good for her. Unfortunately, this was the challenge that she faced. And the reality of life is that we'll all go into a state like that. The most important thing after you fall, regardless of whatever situation you're in, is your ability to pick up, put the pieces together, and then box on. That's the most important thing. Sometimes it's not something you can do alone. And there are people who are out there to help you. As a society, the most important thing that we all need to know is we have to help one another. Diane, talking about this problem is the first step in recovering from the pain and the trauma you experienced. It allows you to come to terms with all that happened. Some people, because it's so traumatic, are unable to even remember, and that's what we call a repression. Now, in such instances, these things linger on in the background and cause them significant challenges psychologically. It might impact her relationship with, as it were, foreigners. It might impact her ability to even trust people. It might impact her ability to feel safe, even within the comfort of people who are dear to her, because it affected her mind in such significant ways that we might not be able to tell until we've actually had a one-on-one interaction. But the most thing here is there is still help out there.
Right.
These things can be dealt with and it can be managed. Beyond the physical challenges, the psychological issues that you're experiencing may be managed. In some instances, you might not even know that you're going through some of these things. But if you see somebody, a professional, somebody that you trust, it shouldn't only be a professional, but somebody that you trust. It could be your spiritual leader, it could be your parents or somebody who's dear to you. Talking about the problem is the first step in getting help. That's all I have to say.
So to wrap up the conversation, this final bit is to both of you. In 2 minutes, I want you to take a minute each and tell us what would be your message of caution maybe to the youth here in Ghana on the back of Diana's story. I'll still come back to you, Mr. Asafo, to take that last bite.
Well, first thing I have to say is the grass is not greener on the other side. The grass can be made greener where you are. As a psychologist, one concept that we tend to hammer a lot is that you should live in the immediate and not in the mind's eye. It's not bad to picture greener pastures or better life circumstances, but if you're doing it, you must do it with caution. You must have enough information, and you must also look at the risks that are involved in this particular endeavor. Sometimes, for lack of a better word, we are confused or we are cajoled by what we see on television or what we read on social media or what people are posting out there to show of what is going on there. I can tell you this as a fact. We've had several people out there who have amazing social media platforms and statuses, but deep down within them, they have significant challenges that we're dealing with. We can create these things here. Immigration is part of us. We all would like to travel, but do it with think about what you want to do,
right,
and make sure that it is legal. Find out, get all your facts before you do it so that you don't have to go and face some of these challenges.
Thank you, Mr. Asafo. Dr. Bwampong, your take on that, and it's a wrap.
Thank you very much. I think I would re-echo what Seth said in terms of making sure that you are well informed before you embark on migration. I believe that there are a lot of spaces in Ghana. If you go to maybe the Ghana Immigration Service and some of the centers that they have opened, you'll be able to get reliable information. So make sure that you get reliable information because perhaps maybe travel agents, for the reason of the money that they want, they might misinform you. So make sure that you get your information right, and don't also be misinformed by social media, posts. It's not always the reality that migrants post out there. Some of them go through a lot of challenges, but they might not tell you the truth. And you can always make it at home. It's just a gradual, process that you need to come into reality with, that life is not, a race, it's not a marathon in itself, if I should put it that way.
Right.
So be patient, make sure that, you get your information right. And also the little money you have, you can invest it into something in Ghana. And it might be able to help you to have that better life that you are looking for elsewhere. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. We're very grateful. Dr. Michael Bwampong is a lecturer in childhood and youth studies and associate professor with the Open University in the United States. Seth Asafo is a clinical psychologist. And on the back of that conversation, we move on to talk about vaccines. 600,000 of those AstraZeneca vaccines hitting the shores of our country. What should we know? What next? That is up next on the AM show. Do stay.